For 20 years, Nolan Reed believed his wife had drowned in the black water beneath Blackwater Lake, where divers pulled a burned-out car from the depths but never recovered a body. He built a quiet life out of the wreckage, raising their son alone, filling his evenings with engine grease and silence. Instead of grief, he refused to name. Then, on a rain-soaked afternoon at the train station, he saw a face he had buried 2 decades earlier. Beside her stood a young woman with gray eyes that matched his own eyes he had only ever seen in a mirror and in his son's face. The woman he had mourned looked at him trembling and whispered 4 words that undid everything he thought he understood about his own life. She told him not to say her name because someone was still watching. If you want to know how a wife the world called dead survived 20 years in silence, subscribe and stay until the end, because the truth she carries will cost someone everything. Nolan Reed had come to the Blackwater station for nothing more complicated than a crate of parts for the 1967 Mustang sitting half-finished in his shop, and he had expected the afternoon to end the way most of his afternoons ended, with grease under his fingernails and the radio playing low while he worked in peace. His life had settled into something manageable over the years: a small restoration garage on the edge of town, a house that still smelled faintly of sawdust, and a son named Elliot, who called less often now that he had built a career of his own 2 states away. Nolan had made peace, or something close to it, with the shape his life had taken after the accident that stole his wife when Elliot was barely 3 years old. He did not expect the crowd at the station to part the way it did, or for his eyes to land on a woman near the ticket counter whose face stopped the breath in his chest. She was older, thinner, and her eyes kept sliding toward the exits, the way a person's eyes move when they have spent years learning not to be found. The station smelled of wet concrete and diesel, and somewhere behind him a departure board clattered through its rotations, but Nolan barely registered any of it. His whole body narrowed down to the single fact of her face. He told himself it was impossible that grief could conjure a dead woman out of any stranger if a man let it, but the longer he looked, the more certain he became that this was no trick of memory. It was Maren, his wife, the woman he had married in a church with peeling paint and buried in a coffin the coroner had sworn contained. Her remains was standing 30 feet away in a station full of people who had no idea the ground beneath them had just shifted. Beside her stood a young woman no older than 20, with dark hair and a familiar set to her jaw, and eyes the exact shade of gray Nolan saw every morning in the mirror, and had seen in his son's face since the day the boy was born. Nolan said her name before he could stop himself, and the sound of it seemed to strike her because Maren flinched, grabbed the younger woman's arm and began pulling her toward the far doors before he had taken a full step forward. He caught them on the sidewalk outside, rain starting to needle down, and demanded to know how a dead woman was standing in front of him breathing. Maren would not look at him directly, her attention fixed instead on a black SUV idling across the street, its windows tinted dark enough that he could not tell whether anyone sat inside. She told him in a voice stripped thin by fear that they could not be seen together in a place full of cameras, and that every second they lingered widened a danger he did not yet understand. When he pressed her, she asked only one thing: that he take them somewhere no one would think to look. Before Nolan could answer, the young woman turned to Maren with a question that landed harder than anything else that afternoon. She asked in a voice caught between hope and disbelief whether this stranger in the rain was truly her father. Nolan drove them to the old storage building behind his garage, a space he used for parts he no longer needed but couldn't bring himself to throw away. And for a long moment, none of them spoke, while rain drummed against the metal roof. The single bulb overhead buzzed and swayed whenever wind pushed through a gap in the siding, throwing long shadows across shelves crowded with carburetors and coiled hose, and the smell of old motor oil settled over the 3 of them like something almost comforting in its ordinariness. Nolan sat on an overturned crate because his legs did not entirely trust him to stand, and he studied the 2 women across from him the way he might study an engine that refused to start searching for the one detail that would explain everything. He could not stop looking at the young woman, could not reconcile the shape of her face with anything he understood about his own history. Yet some old instinct in him refused to dismiss what his eyes kept insisting was true. Maren finally broke the silence, her hands wrapped tightly around a paper cup of coffee she had not touched, and told him that when she vanished 20 years earlier, she had been carrying a child neither of them yet knew existed. Cold moved through Nolan's chest because even in the depths of his grief, He had never imagined a version of the truth that included a daughter he had never been told about. The young woman introduced herself as Sloane, though she said the borrowed surname carefully, as if it belonged to a costume rather than a name. She explained that she had grown up believing her father died before she was born, a story repeated so many times it had calcified into something she never thought to question. Only 2 weeks earlier, her mother had finally told her that her father was not dead at all, that he was alive and living less than a day's drive from where they had been hiding. Sloane did not call Nolan anything resembling a father in that first conversation, choosing instead to study him the way a person studies a stranger who happens to share their face, cataloging the similarities without yet trusting what they might mean. Nolan noticed that she pressed her fingers against the edge of the table when she grew tense, an unconscious habit identical to one he shared with Elliot, and the resemblance rattled him more than any words could have. He told them plainly that 2 decades of lies could not be undone by a resemblance however striking, and that he needed proof before he let himself believe any of it. Marin agreed without hesitation, but warned him they could not send a sample to any ordinary laboratory because Gideon Wycliffe had people embedded in hospitals, courts, and private data firms across the region. The name hit Nolan like a stone dropped into still water because he remembered it from the earliest days of their marriage, back when Marin's family had made their disapproval of a small-town mechanic marrying into their world unmistakably clear. He understood then that whatever had pulled his wife back from the dead was not a simple story of a woman running from grief, but something far larger and far more dangerous than he had allowed himself to imagine. Before he could ask another question, Marin reached into her bag and set a photograph on the table between them, its edges worn soft from handling. It showed Nolan and Elliot at a school science fair, the boy grinning behind a cardboard volcano, gap-toothed and maybe 9 years old. An ordinary evening frozen in time, except that Elliot's 9th birthday had come 6 years after the date carved on Marin's headstone. She had not only survived, she had been close enough to photograph her son growing up, and she had chosen the picture deliberately, so Nolan would understand there had been no single distant accident, but 20 years of watching from the dark. The story that unfolded that evening carried Nolan back 2 decades, to a version of his life he had only ever understood in fragments. Marin had been born into the Wycliffe family, daughter of the late Augustus Wycliffe, founder of Wycliffe Crown Holdings, an empire built across decades of shrewd investment and careful public image. She had never wanted the crown that came with the name, choosing instead to marry a mechanic from a town most of her relatives could not find on a map, and she had endured her family's cold disapproval without complaint, because Nolan had never once made her feel like a consolation prize. In the early years of their marriage, she used to joke that the Wycliffe name was a coat she had finally learned to take off, hanging it by the door of their small house, and stepping into a life measured in oil changes and grocery lists instead of boardrooms. She had believed foolishly, perhaps, that distance alone would keep the family's ambitions from ever touching the life she had built. After Augustus died, his younger brother Gideon assumed control of the company, and with it, control over nearly everything the Wycliffe name still touched. Marin had watched her uncle tighten his grip on the family fortune with a patience that unsettled her long before she understood exactly why. 3 days before she disappeared, she discovered that Gideon had been siphoning hundreds of millions of dollars out of the company's employee pension fund through a web of shell corporations designed to obscure the trail. Digging further, sleepless and increasingly afraid, she found documents suggesting her own father's signature had been forged across dozens of financial filings in the years before his death, papers that would have exposed a fraud stretching back further than she dared imagine. She decided to gather every piece of evidence she could find and deliver it to federal investigators, believing naively that the truth alone would be enough to protect her family from her uncle's ambition. Gideon learned of her plan before she could act on it, and his response was not a threat spoken aloud, but a manila envelope left on her doorstep containing photographs of Nolan and Elliot, taken without their knowledge, proof that her family knew exactly where to find the people she loved most. Silas Crow, the family's longtime director of security, came to her that same week with an offer that felt less like rescue and more like surrender. He told her that if she wanted her husband and son to stay safe, her death would have to be real in every detail, because Gideon would never be fooled by a staged disappearance if Nolan's mourning ever wavered into something less than genuine. A car resembling Marin's was pushed into Blackwater Lake and set ablaze before it sank, and the dental records used to identify the body recovered from the wreckage were quietly substituted by someone loyal to the family. Maren told herself in the earliest days of her exile that she would only need to disappear for a few months, just long enough for Silas to build a case strong enough to protect her when she came home. Those months stretched into years, and the years eventually became 2 decades she never intended to lose. Nolan asked her, his voice low and controlled in a way that frightened him more than shouting would have, why she never came back once she believed herself safe. Maren's answer came slowly, each word costing her something. She told him that Silas had once tried to bring her home, arranging the earliest stages of a return that would have reunited her with Nolan and introduced him to the daughter he never knew he had. Before that plan could move forward, Silas vanished without explanation, and every channel Maren had used to reach the outside world went silent within days of his disappearance. She spent those 20 years moving through a patchwork of borrowed names and rented rooms, first through Oregon, then north into Montana, eventually settling for a time near the Canadian border before putting down something resembling roots in a small coastal town in Maine. She learned to live light, keeping a single suitcase packed beneath whatever bed she slept in, and she learned the particular loneliness of watching other families gather at diner tables on ordinary Sunday mornings. While she sat alone with a newspaper she used more as a shield than a source of news. There were towns where she stayed only weeks, and towns where she stayed years, and in every one of them she kept a small photograph of Nolan folded inside a coat pocket, worn soft at the creases from being unfolded too many times in the dark. In the earliest years, Silas had still been able to send her photographs of Nolan and Elliot, proof that they remained safe. Each image a small mercy that let her sleep through another night of exile. He had also warned her again and again that Gideon's people had never stopped watching Blackwater, waiting patiently for the moment she made a mistake that would confirm what he already suspected. Maren wrote letters during those years, dozens of them addressed to a husband who would never receive a single one, because she trusted no method of delivery except passing them through. Silas and Silas alone controlled whether they ever left his hands. When he disappeared, she was left with no way to know whether he had betrayed her, been discovered by Gideon, or simply been erased the way so many inconvenient people in her family's orbit seemed to vanish. Without a trusted intermediary, she convinced herself that any attempt to reach out would place Nolan and Elliot directly in danger, and so she let the silence continue long after the fear that justified it had curdled into something closer to habit. Nolan listened to all of it without softening, unwilling to accept an explanation that reduced his son's entire childhood to a decision made on his behalf. He told her plainly that grief he could forgive, but the theft of his right to know the truth about his own life was a different kind of wound entirely. Sloane, who had said little through most of the conversation, finally spoke up with a question of her own, asking her mother whether the same lie had been used to keep both sides of the family from ever finding each other. Maren did not flinch from the accusation. She admitted that fear alone no longer explained everything, that somewhere in the passing years, she had simply lost the ability to imagine what a return might look like, or how she would begin explaining 20 years of absence to a husband and son who had already learned to live without her. Nolan asked her more sharply now why she had chosen this particular moment to resurface after so long spent hiding. In answer, Maren slid a thick folder across the table, its cover embossed with the small silver crown that marked every official document belonging to Wycliffe Crown Holdings. Sloane would turn 21 in exactly 3 days, and that single fact, Maren explained, carried the power to unravel everything Gideon Wycliffe had spent 2 decades building. Augustus Wycliffe, before his death, had structured a trust that held 51% of the voting shares in the company, a controlling stake designed to protect it from exactly the kind of consolidation Gideon had since achieved. Gideon had only ever been granted temporary stewardship of those shares, under the condition that Maren had died without leaving behind a legitimate heir of her own. A hidden clause within the trust, one Gideon believed had died with Augustus, specified that control would automatically revert to Maren or to her biological child the moment that child turned 21, and that the transfer would trigger a mandatory audit of every pension fund and corporate account the company controlled. For 20 years, Gideon had built his empire on the confident assumption that Maren was dead and that no heir existed to threaten his position. He was at that very moment finalizing the sale of a substantial portion of the company to a foreign investment fund, a deal structured to close before Sloane's birthday could make her legal claim impossible to ignore. Once that sale closed, Marin explained the financial evidence of Gideon's fraud would be scattered across so many shell companies that even a federal investigation might never fully reconstruct it. She possessed only a copy of the trust's hidden clause because the sole original document had been hidden by Silas Crow somewhere in Blackwater before his disappearance. Days before showing up at the train station, Moran had received a recording from a lawyer representing Silas's estate, a message set to release automatically after his death, and in it, Silas revealed that the original document had been concealed inside something belonging to Nolan. Nolan felt the memory surface before he consciously reached for it. The image of a wooden toolbox Marin had given him the day he opened his garage, a gift he had treasured enough to keep for 20 years without ever suspecting it, held anything but wrenches and sockets. The three of them drove back to the shop through streets slick with rain, headlights smearing gold across the wet asphalt, and none of them spoke because there seemed to be nothing left that words could accomplish. When they arrived, Nolan found the toolbox exactly where it had always sat undisturbed in the corner of the storage room for 2 full decades, its brass latches dulled with age but still intact beneath a thin film of dust. When he pried it open, his hands were not entirely steady, and what he found waiting inside was not the sealed document Marin had described, but a room that had clearly been searched already, drawers overturned and the lock on the storage door forced open sometime before their arrival. Scrawled across the wall behind the emptied toolbox in handwriting none of them recognized was a single sentence meant to be read as both a warning and a threat that the dead ought to know better than to stop staying buried. Instead of retreating, Nolan did the thing Marin's family had never expected a small-town mechanic to do. He refused to be careful. Shaken but unwilling to run, he reached out that same night to Delaney Price, a lawyer he had trusted since their school years, and the only person he knew with the expertise to make sense of a trust document this complicated. She arrived at the garage still dressed from a late night at her own office, reading glasses pushed up into her hair, and listened to the entire story without once interrupting her expression, shifting slowly from polite skepticism to something closer to alarm as the pieces fit together in front of her. Delaney confirmed that the clause Marin described could well be legally binding, but cautioned that a photocopy alone would never survive the scrutiny of a company as well-resourced and well-lawyered as Wycliffe Crown Holdings. It was Nolan, not Delaney, who insisted on bringing in Elliot, even though the suggestion meant reopening a wound he had spent years protecting his son from, because he had decided he would rather his son hate him for the truth than thank him for another lie. Elliot's career as a forensic data auditor made him uniquely suited to trace the layers of shell companies Gideon had used to hide his fraud. He arrived in Blackwater the following morning, fully convinced that his father had fallen victim to a pair of con artists preying on an old man's unresolved grief, and he had rehearsed the entire drive down a version of the conversation where he gently but firmly talked his father back to reason. That certainty collapsed the moment he saw Marin's face in person, recognizing in an instant the same features he had only ever known from a handful of surviving photographs kept in a drawer. His father rarely opened photographs he used to study as a boy, trying to imagine a voice to match the smile. Something in his chest went hollow and cold, the careful speech he had prepared dissolving into nothing at all. There was no tearful reunion, no embrace between a mother and son separated by 20 years of silence. Instead, Elliot asked her with a controlled fury that surprised even him, where she had been during every birthday, every graduation, every night his father worked a second job just to keep a roof over their heads. Marin did not attempt to defend herself, telling him only that she was sorry and that she understood if forgiveness was something he could never offer her, no matter how much time passed or how much truth eventually came to light. Sloane watched the exchange in silence, absorbing for the first time the full weight of what her own survival had cost someone else, a half-brother, whose childhood had been shaped entirely by an absence she had never had to endure. Before Elliot could walk away, something about the proportions of the toolbox caught his auditor's eye, a base that sat noticeably thicker than its dimensions should allow. Beneath a false panel at the bottom, he found a hidden compartment holding a single object, the antique pocket watch that had once belonged to Augustus Wycliffe himself. There was no document folded inside, no legal paper to prove anything in a courtroom, only a small brass key and a handwritten string of numbers that Elliot immediately recognized as a bank account. and he traced it far enough to discover it corresponded to a safety deposit box frozen on the exact date 20 years earlier that Maren was declared legally dead. Delaney filed an emergency motion the following morning to force the bank to open the frozen box, and word of the filing reached Gideon Wycliffe faster than any of them anticipated. Within hours, Wycliffe Crown Holdings launched a coordinated media campaign painting Nolan as a man being manipulated by an imposter, attempting to extort the family for money, complete with grainy photographs of him and Maren at the train station, splashed across local news broadcasts. Longtime customers began canceling contracts with Nolan's garage overnight. His bank accounts came under sudden and unexplained scrutiny, and police arrived within the week to search his property based on an anonymous tip claiming he possessed documents stolen from the Wycliffe family. Nolan endured all of it with a grim, practiced patience, understanding by then that Gideon's reach extended into places he had never imagined a single family could touch. But instead of hiding, he did the one thing that unsettled the family most. He called the same reporters back and offered them Lydia Voss. Gideon himself appeared at the garage not long after the police left, arriving without warning, and without the security detail Nolan had expected a man of his stature to require, dressed in a coat too fine for a town like Blackwater, his shoes clicking against the concrete with an unhurried confidence that made Nolan's jaw tighten. I walked slowly among the half-finished cars, running one gloved finger along a fender, as though inspecting merchandise rather than standing inside a stranger's livelihood. He made no direct threats, choosing instead a quieter and more insidious approach, offering Nolan $20 million in exchange for a signed statement declaring that the woman traveling with him was not in fact Maren Wycliffe. Gideon reasoned aloud that Nolan owed nothing to a wife who had let him believe her dead for 2 decades, framing the offer as mercy rather than a bribe. And for one unsettling moment, surrounded by the wreckage of his reputation, Nolan felt something close to temptation, though it had far less to do with the money than with a rage toward Maren he had not yet allowed himself to fully feel. Then Gideon made his first true mistake. He referred to Sloane by her full legal name, a name known only to Maren, Nolan, and Delaney, a detail that should have been impossible for him to know unless he had been tracking the girl for years. The slip told Nolan exactly how long Gideon had actually known of his niece's existence, and rather than let the moment pass, Nolan quietly turned on the shop's security camera behind him and let Gideon keep talking, guiding the conversation until the man admitted in his own smooth voice that he had watched the girl since she was a child. Nolan refused the offer outright, and within days, a discreet paternity test conducted under Delaney's supervision confirmed what he had already begun to accept in his heart, that Sloane was his daughter, with a probability that left no reasonable room for doubt. Delaney warned them that private test results, however conclusive, would never be enough on their own to sway a corporate board loyal to Gideon's version of events. That same evening, Gideon sent Sloane a private message, one crafted with the precision of a man who understood exactly which doubts would cut deepest, suggesting without offering any specifics that her mother had never told her the full truth about the night the car went into the lake. Rattled, Sloane arranged a secret meeting with Gideon at the Wycliffe family's downtown hotel, desperate to understand what piece of the story her mother had left incomplete, and she sat across from him in a lounge of muted gold and marble, acutely aware that everyone around her seemed to know exactly who he was, while no one had any idea who she was. It was a strange and unsettling kind of invisibility for a woman who had just learned she stood to inherit half of everything in the room. Gideon presented her with documents showing that Maren had at one point been offered a place in a formal witness protection program, a legitimate path to safety. She had ultimately declined, and he used the revelation, carefully planting the idea that her mother had never been purely a victim of circumstance, but a woman who had at least in part chosen the life of hiding that followed. But Sloane had inherited more than her father's eyes, and instead of swallowing the doubt, she carried it straight back to Maren and set it on the table between them. Maren did not deny it. She admitted that fear alone had not been the whole reason for her refusal, explaining that the program would have required surrendering every piece of evidence she had gathered and permanently severing her ability to shape the future of the child she was carrying, and that she had never been certain the official handling her case wasn't already compromised by Gideon's money, which made the offered protection feel less like safety and more like another kind of trap. Nolan remained disappointed by the choice, but he found himself beginning to understand, however reluctantly, that nearly every decision Maren had made over 20 years had been shaped by a system Gideon had already learned to bend to his will. "Elliot," Meanwhile, spent his nights combing through Silas Crow's old digital records and uncovered dozens of the letters Marin had written and mailed to Blackwater over the years. Every one of them rerouted to a storage facility owned by a security firm under Wycliffe control. Gideon, it turned out, had been intercepting his niece's correspondence for the better part of 2 decades, ensuring that not a single word of her attempted contact ever reached the family she had left behind. In the final letter, Elliot recovered, dated only a week before Silas vanished, Marin had written that she intended to come home no matter the danger, and the discovery gave Elliot a version of his mother he had not expected, a woman who had genuinely tried to return long before he was ready to forgive her for the years she had not. The deeper Elliot dug, the more one name kept surfacing at the center of the shell companies, the company's longtime chief financial officer, Miles Harrow, whose signatures appeared on the very transfers that had drained the pension fund. Elliot did not wait for Miles to surface on his own. He compiled the trail name by name and date by date and had Delaney serve Miles with formal notice that his signature sat on the fraud, that a federal audit was days away, and that Gideon fully intended to hand him the blame. Cornered by his own paperwork rather than by luck, Miles Harrow reached out to Delaney within 48 hours, and what he told her changed the direction of everything. Delaney, working a separate angle, had also tracked down the forensic pathologist who originally signed off on the identification of the body pulled from Blackwater Lake, a woman named Lydia Voss, who had long since left the county coroner's office. Under careful questioning in a small kitchen that still smelled of the coffee she had brewed out of nervous habit, Lydia admitted that the dental records used in the identification had been quietly swapped by a superior before she ever saw the original file, a confession she had carried in silence for 20 years out of fear for her career and her safety. Her hands shook as she spoke, and she confessed she had thought about that file more nights than she could count, wondering whether the woman she had unknowingly helped erase was still out there, still alive, still waiting for someone to tell the truth. She agreed to testify, but only if Delaney could guarantee her legal protection from whatever retaliation Gideon might attempt once her statement became public. With Lydia's cooperation secured, Delaney finally forced open the long-frozen safety deposit box tied to the numbers hidden inside Augustus Wycliffe's pocket watch. Instead of the original trust document they had all hoped to find, the box contained nothing but an empty envelope and a single photograph, one showing Miles Harrow removing something from that very box a full decade earlier. It was the sight of that photograph and Elliot's audit closing around him that had finally broken Miles, and when he came to Delaney, he came with everything. He confirmed that Silas Crow had asked him years earlier to safeguard the original trust document, fearing correctly that not even a bank vault would stay beyond Gideon's reach forever, and that he had stayed silent for a decade, only because Gideon had threatened to pin the company's entire pattern of fraud on him if he ever spoke a word. With Sloane's birthday now less than a day away, Gideon convened an emergency meeting of the board of directors, determined to push the foreign sale through, before midnight stripped him of the authority to approve it alone. Nolan, Marin, Sloane, Elliot, and Delaney arrived together at the towering Wycliffe Crown headquarters, its glass facade, catching the last orange light of evening, only to be stopped at the lobby because Marin remained on every official record, a woman who had been legally dead for 20 years. Security guards in dark suits formed a quiet wall in front of the elevators, polite but immovable. And for several tense minutes it seemed the entire confrontation might end there in a marble lobby before it had properly begun. It was Nolan who broke the standoff, not with a lawyer's argument, but with a mechanic's bluntness, stepping forward and playing the security camera recording of Gideon naming Sloane A. loud over the lobby's own sound system, loud enough that the arriving board members could not pretend they had not heard it. Gideon met them himself, visibly amused, mocking Nolan in front of the gathering directors as nothing more than a small-town mechanic whose greed had finally gotten the better of him. But the recording had already done its work, and when Miles Harrow walked in behind them, unannounced and no longer afraid, the room's certainty began to tilt. Miles confirmed without being asked that he had removed the documents from the safety deposit box 10 years earlier, a fact everyone first assumed would only strengthen Gideon's position, until he explained that Silas Crow had asked him to move it precisely because the vault was no longer safe. He had spent 30 years climbing the company's ranks, training himself to look the other way, through smaller compromises he told himself did not matter. But he found he could not stand in a room and watch factory workers and receptionists lose their retirements to fund a stranger's yacht in a private island off the coast of a country he could not even pronounce. He produced the original trust document on the spot, along with independently verified copies of the paternity results. Lydia Voss's signed statement and the intercepted letters Elliot had traced back to Wycliffe-owned storage facilities. The papers were spread across the long mahogany table one by one, each landing with a quiet finality that seemed to hush the entire room. And several board members who had spent years nodding along to Gideon's decisions now sat in visible discomfort, unable to meet his eyes. Laid together, the evidence left no room for doubt, confirming both that Maren Wycliffe Reed was alive and that Sloan stood as the legitimate heir to a controlling interest in the company her grandfather had built. Gideon made one final desperate attempt to force the foreign sale through before the clock struck midnight, but the moment Sloan's birthday arrived, his temporary authority over the disputed shares was automatically suspended by the very clause he had spent 20 years believing no longer existed. Sloan now held the deciding voice over 51% of Wycliffe Crown holdings, a fact that visibly unsettled Gideon more than any accusation leveled against him that night, because he clearly expected retribution equal to everything he had taken. Standing before the seat that had once belonged to her grandfather, she made her first decision as the company's controlling shareholder, and she did not choose to remove Gideon out of vengeance. Instead, she ordered the company's entire financial history opened without restriction to federal investigators. Gideon Wycliffe was suspended from his position within days, facing formal charges of fraud, document forgery, and obstruction of a federal investigation. His empire dismantled not through any dramatic act of revenge, but through the quiet weight of the paperwork he had spent 2 decades believing was permanently under his control. Maren refused every suggestion that she step into the role of chief executive herself, choosing instead to hand day-to-day authority to an independent oversight board, while insisting as her first and only non-negotiable condition that the depleted pension fund be restored to every employee it had once belonged to. Sloan wanted no part of a life defined entirely by inherited wealth and corporate obligation, and she agreed to retain her voting authority but chose to remain focused on finishing her education, involving herself only in the company's most significant ethical decisions rather than its daily operations. Elliot was not yet ready to call Maren his mother, and he made no pretense otherwise, but he agreed to let her write to him again. This time using a real address and no intermediary standing between them, and he found himself against his own expectations, checking the mailbox a little more eagerly than he would have admitted to anyone. Sloan asked her father quietly, without any real expectation, whether he wanted to run the paternity test a second time, now that the truth carried no legal urgency behind it, and Nolan told her he did not need another piece of paper to confirm what he had understood the moment he first saw her eyes at the train station. Maren asked him for a chance to begin again, though she asked it carefully, without any assumption that the years lost between them could simply be waved away by good intentions. Nolan did not slide his wedding ring back onto his finger that night, and he did not pretend that 20 years of grief and silence could be forgiven in a single conversation. Telling her plainly that the marriage they once shared had ended the day the world declared her dead, and that whatever came next would have to be something new, built honestly from the ground up rather than salvaged from what had been lost. Maren accepted that condition without argument, and for a moment something in her posture eased, as though she had braced for a harsher answer than the one he gave. She asked almost tentatively whether she might come back to the garage the following morning, and Nolan considered the question for a long moment before answering that tomorrow sounded like a reasonable place to start. A year passed before Blackwater truly settled back into something resembling ordinary life, though nothing about it felt quite the same as before. Reed Restoration reopened under a freshly painted sign, but Nolan kept the old wooden toolbox exactly where it had always sat in the corner of his office, a reminder he had no interest in packing away. Wycliffe Crown Holdings entered a long and painful restructuring under new oversight, its pension fund gradually restored to the employees who had been quietly robbed of it, while Gideon awaited trial as former allies within his own network chose cooperation with investigators over loyalty to a man whose empire had already collapsed. Elliot began having dinner with Maren every few weeks, cautious and imperfect, the two of them relearning each other slowly rather than pretending 20 years apart could be erased through effort alone. Sloane spent her school breaks working part-time at the garage, admitting freely that she had little natural talent for engine repair, often leaving smudges of grease on her jeans that never quite washed out. Though she discovered almost by accident that she could recognize a faulty engine sound with the same instinctive ear her father possessed. Maren and Nolan had not remarried, choosing instead to date cautiously, arguing sometimes over small things, relearning each other's habits and history without flinching away from the parts of the past that still ached. On a quiet afternoon many months later, with autumn light slanting low through the open bay doors and the radio humming an old song neither of them bothered to name, Nolan stood beside Sloane in front of a fully restored Mustang gleaming under the shop's fluorescent lights, its work finally complete after months of careful attention. The car's paint caught the light the way it had the day Maren first gave him the toolbox, a coincidence Nolan chose to notice rather than dismiss. Sloane caught his reflection in the rearview mirror, and for the first time since the day they met at that rain-soaked train station, she called him something other than a stranger who happened to share her face. She called him Dad. Nolan did not answer right away. He set down the wrench in his hand, wiped his palm slowly against a rag that had been his father's before it was his, and let the moment settle over him the way sunlight settles over a room after a long storm finally passes. Then he only smiled, watching the gray eyes that had once dragged his entire past back into the present, eyes that were no longer a reminder of everything he had lost but a quiet promise of everything still ahead. If this story held you to the end, do me a favor and tell me in the comments whom did you forgive, first Maren or Gideon, and why, because I read every one. Subscribe if you want more stories about ordinary people who refuse to stay buried, and I will see you in the next one.